Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for day number 7 at Worlds in 2023, or at least in the Swiss stage of Worlds in 2023. We are finally starting to really get an idea for the teams that are going to be competing for an opportunity in the quarterfinals over the next couple of days. It's going to be really exciting. We've only got a few series left here in round number 4 before we move on to the 5th and final round of the Swiss stage, which of course everybody's incredibly excited about. We've got 2 series to cover here today on day number 7, one of them being an elimination series where one of the teams will officially be gone from Worlds 2023, and the other will be a qualification series with 2-2-1 teams to see who the next team to qualify for the quarterfinals will be. But really excited for both of them. If you are excited, let me know down in the comments section below. What did you think was going to happen in both of these series here today? How did you think both of these teams were going to do? Would love to know your thoughts and opinions down below. Of course, if you do find yourself enjoying the video at any point throughout the next however long this is, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying it. Hit subscribe so you can be there for all the videos that come out for the rest of Worlds. But I don't want to pander too much to you guys. It's time to jump into the content. If you are new here, what we're going to do in this video is go game by game in both of the series today, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game, and at the end of each series, I'll be giving a player of the series to kind of tie everything up. At the end of the video, we're quickly going to go over the day 8 games, the rest of round number 4 here, the final day of that round, if you will, and we're going to preview that, kind of talk about who I predict to be able to win those games, and just give a little bit of a rundown. But most of today's video is going to be covering the action that happened on day number 7. So, without further ado, let's jump right into our first series, and it is going to be the Elimination Series first, which is certainly a higher profile one, because losing it means the end of your tournament line. Now, this is a pretty big mismatch on paper. Talked about this in yesterday's video about how this really shouldn't be particularly close at all between these two teams, but I think one of them is very excited to be in the spot that they're in, having won a best of 3 here at Worlds, and the other absolutely mortified to be 1-2 throughout the first couple of series. But it's a matchup between the number 4 seed from the LCK in Dplus KIA and the number 1 seed from the VCS in GAM Esports. Certainly a mismatch on paper. You have, DK coming in from one of the biggest regions in the world in the LCK, one of the top 2 regions clearly in the world at the current moment. And then you have GAM, a wildcard team, barely making it out of play-ins, getting a really good draw on their side of the bracket, being able to take down their region mates in Team Wales to qualify for the main stage, and then actually being able to take down Team Liquid in a best of 3 to get to this part. They've already overachieved so much. I think both me and a lot of other people didn't even predict them to make it out of the play-in stage, let alone to win a series in the Swiss stage. So they've already done a whole ton. They've had a lot of players that I think have really stepped up and looked good at this tournament. I think Kati has looked very solid, but we kind of expected that. KIA has looked very good at this tournament, but again, we expected that. Those of us who watch the VCS know how good KIA and Kati have been over the course of this year, but in my opinion, the biggest surprise positive for this team has been Pallet in the support position. He's had a really good tournament. I was really low on Pallet, like crazy low. He was my last ranked support coming into this tournament. I did not see it. I did not see it at all, really. I thought Slater did a really good job of exerting pressure early on in laning phases, and when he would win, it would often be his aggression that ended up getting them positives, and Pallet was just kind of along for the ride, as I put it in my primer video. It's not really been that way at Worlds so far. Pallet has been a big playmaker. He's been someone that this team can play around, and that's going to be a big deciding factor for this series, because when you look at DK on the other side of this matchup, obviously they're more talented in every single lane. That goes without saying, because they are an LCK team taking on a VCS team. They have to be more talented across the board. That's just how you qualify for Worlds out of the LCK. You just have to be really good, and it's Damwon, it's DK, right? It's one of the most legendary organizations in the LCK, former world champions, but they've struggled a bit in certain lanes here at this tournament. Deft and Kellen in particular have really not played well, and that's a concern. If Kellen continues to be one of the more lackluster supports in the main stage of this tournament, I think that's going to hold this team back. Deft has certainly not pushed his team forward either. Now, that being said, both of them were significantly better against BDS in their previous best of 3 that they ended up winning to get here in the first place, but they're going to need to continue to be better. Obviously, they're better than Slater and Pallet, or at the very least, they should be better than Slater and Pallet, but I think that bot lane is really going to be the big lane kind of that determines how the series ends up going and whether or not it's closer than a lot of us expect, because I don't really, as much as I like KIA and Levy and Katsi, I just don't think they're going to be able to go up against Kana and Canyon and Showmaker and some of the best players to ever play in their roles and Canyon and Showmaker in the jungle mid position. So certainly something to keep an eye out for, but DK is definitely favorites in this, and honestly, if they don't win 2-0, it's a pretty big upset coming in from GAM if they're able to take a game, but we're going to go ahead and see if they can, pull off any major upsets, shock the world here with any wins, starting with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was Dplus KIA. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and this is kind of what you expected. This was a really dominant win coming in from DK. They were by far the better of these two teams throughout this first game, and I mean, really, if anything else happened, I would be saying that something has gone terribly wrong for DK. This is a matchup that really should not be particularly close, and at least in game number 1, it wasn't. I see a lot of people on social media, Reddit, Twitter, etc., talking about draft and saying how GAM did a pretty good job in draft to get some high-profile picks and to really kind of establish pressure in the early game. And while I do agree that there are some good picks here, some power picks, quote-unquote, that teams have really prioritized over the course of this tournament up until this point. I'm a little bit lower on a lot of these picks. A lot of the picks that I'm super high on, got banned out in this game. Things like the Xayah, things like the Alistar, things like the Maokai, really, even in that same vein. I think they've been more of the consistent threats over the course of this tournament. The Rakan, obviously, has been very big. I do understand the idea of the Wombo combo here. You get the Jarvan Cataclysm, you get the Rumble Equalizer, you get the Orianna Shockwave. That's a really difficult combo to end up dealing with if you have, tempo, if you're on the front foot in this game. But honestly, you don't really have a lot of tempo in this draft. You don't really have a lot of early game presence. You scale really well, and if you are able to get to the late game, obviously Ori plus Zeri plus Rumble is this terrifying teamfight comp to have to play into. Obviously, Jarvan does help that a lot, and Rakan's one of the best champions in the game. If you do hit the teamfight stage, you have a lot of tools and options to be able to win the game from there. But the problem with that is you're actually taking away a lot of agency from your team in the early game with a lot of the lanes that you drafted. You blind picked Orianna, which a ton of teams are doing right now at this tournament. And again, I'm sorry if you watch all of my videos. You're probably tired of hearing me say it at this point. But for those of you who are new, I'm super low on blind pick Orianna, at least in comparison to what other teams are clearly doing. I've seen a lot of B1, a lot of R1 blind pick Orianna at this tournament, and there are just too many picks that do well into Orianna for it to really matter. Sylas is one of them. He can basically just run the early game and specifically run the mid game. Ori takes a long time to actually be relevant. Her laning phase is not nearly as safe as people want it to be at this point. And there are a lot of champions that are meta, like Syndra and like Sylas, that can do relatively well into Orianna. And so we saw that again here, although Kati did play well. We'll talk about that when we get there. I think more concerningly is the fact that it seems DK has a read similar to mine on the meta, which is the fact that Xayah is kind of the S-tier AD carry right now, the one that you should prioritize over everybody. And GAM, I think, recognized that as well, banning it out. But once Xayah is gone, Kai'Sa is basically a free pick. I see a lot of people basically giving up on Kai'Sa, but look at Kai'Sa's performances over this tournament. All of her bad performances are against Xayah, and every single time she's not against Xayah, she absolutely dominates games. She's still, that S-tier number 2 AD carry in the meta. You just can't pick her into Xayah. That's kind of been the problem, but you ban out Xayah, B1 Kai'Sa, it's still really strong, and we saw that in this game. It does really well into Zeri. I think Kai'Sa is just a better version of what Zeri offers at the current moment, so even if you do have Rakan on that side of the matchup, I would say bot lane, from a draft perspective, is super in favor of DK with the Rel as well. Deft is going to get player of the game through a lot of that bot lane pressure that they were able to generate. We'll talk about Palette making a lot of uncharacteristic, or maybe characteristic mistakes, depending on where you want to call it, but Deft was awesome in this game, being able to capitalize on basically every resource that he was given. I think it's very difficult in games like this to be able to play super aggro on Kai'Sa if you're not, in a position where your Lee Sin's very active on the map, and Canyon did play well. I want to give him credit, and Showmaker, had good moments, even if Kati, I think, was doing a really good job of trying to contain him in the early game, but when Deft and Kellen really broke out in this game, especially towards the back half of the early game, right at the beginning of the mid game, around 11 or 12 minutes into the game, all of a sudden, this game becomes almost infinitely more difficult for GAM to win. Like, it's much, much harder to stop Kai'Sa than it is to generate a lot of pressure in the mid game here for GAM, and so Deft being as good as he was in this game and having a bounce-back performance, I think, was incredibly important. Kellen looking really good on the Rel. Obviously, he's struggled quite a bit over the course of this tournament. He's played a lot of things like Alistar and like Nautilus and like the Rel, a lot of these engagers, and obviously we know he can perform really highly on those. He's been a top-tier support at the LCK level for quite a long time, an underrated amount of time. He was really good last year. He was really good on Nongshim before that, and he's always kind of been a highly prioritized support prospect, even going back to his early days in the LCK. I just don't think it's necessarily clicked for him at this tournament. Obviously, they've been swapping him and Bible out throughout the year. In terms of the support position, he's been the better player for DK, and so I was excited to see what he'd be able to do at this tournament. It's not quite clicked for him, but this was a very good game. It does feel like potentially the BDS series kind of got him back on track in terms of how he's going to look at a lot of these engaged threats in the early game. Him and Deft were definitely the carries in this one, and that's a very good sign. I think Kana played really well on the Cassante, another champion that I think is just like crazy strong right now, one that I value at a super high level. Kaisa and Cassante are two champions that I just think are way undervalued by the community at the moment. People are hyping up Rumble and people are hyping up Aatrox and some of these other top lane picks. For me, it's still Cassante. It is still Cassante as your number one S tier top lane. He's just going to offer you the consistency that a lot of these other picks do not offer. As much as I like Rumble, he's counterable in the early game. He's really susceptible to early pressure, and if he doesn't get to the late game, then he's really never going to offer the same things that some of the other top laners do. Cassante is very good throughout every part of the game. It's just very consistent. I really like the state that he's in, maybe not for game balance, but in terms of being able to pick it and be super active. Now, the Lee Sin obviously worked out for Canyon. You put Lee Sin on a good player, it's going to work. Showmaker looked a little shaky at the beginning, but I chalked that up more to Kati playing well than Showmaker playing bad. I think he obviously course-corrected very well towards the back half of this game and was able to make a really big impact in some of these fights. But overall, I think DK played really well. And then for GAM, they tried. Kati played really well. He had a couple of moments where he really was trying to create action on the Orianna. I'm lower on the champion pick in general as somebody who does play Orianna. The strengths are definitely still there. Like, she's probably the best team fighter in the game. Maybe regardless of position, you could argue that Xayah or Kaisa could fill that role just as well, but Ori's right up there with them in terms of the output that she's actually able to produce in the late game, but her early game still is very susceptible, and we've seen that multiple times throughout the tournament. Kati did a good job of being able to negate a lot of those weaknesses and still being a positive threat overall. It was just everybody else on the map that was kind of a negative. Done of the game pretty easily is going to go to Pallet in this one on the Rakan. A couple of really bad plays coming in from him. Rakan is super strong, and, you would imagine that Pallet would be able to pilot it well considering how he's played at this tournament up until this point, but this very much more so felt like VCS Pallet rather than Worlds Pallet, which is disappointing. This is the kind of tape that I saw from him domestically that led to me putting him as the number 23 support at this tournament. And so, I still like him as a player. He's played well at this tournament, and he's got upside, and clearly, I missed on him, but this is more of what I was expecting to see when we saw GAM qualify for this tournament, was this kind of performance. So Slater didn't really do a whole ton on the Zeri. Zeri's really not good into Kaisa. I do not understand this R5 pick. I get that you potentially just want to scale here, that you just want an AD carry that you can teamfight with in the late game to pair up with your Orianna to stack up with the Rumble to really make this a more teamfight-oriented comp, but doing that against a team like DK with Canyon on Lee Sin and with Deft playing something like a Kaisa that can actually make plays in the mid game, it's really hard to actually execute on that. It's going to be very rare for you to play a scaling comp into DK and not just get absolutely blasted early to ever actually get to the part of the game where you can scale. It's a very risky strategy, and it did not pay off, and I think Slater, the Zeri, was definitely a problem for that. KIA was, I guess, fine on the Rumble, didn't really do anything. Levy, was obviously sick going into these games. Hopefully he's okay, but he didn't look particularly good on the Jarvan. It just feels like GAM is outmatched, and you know what? They should be. They should be outmatched. This should not be a close series. This is kind of what we expected from game number 1, and I would expect this to continue onwards, but GAM is not eliminated yet. They still have, at the very least, one more game to try and come out and compete against a team like DK. Maybe they can go for something a little bit more early game focus that could give them a bit more tempo, a bit more control of maybe the destiny that they have. I'd like that a bit more, but for DK, you just got to hold the line. You got to continue to outperform your opponents, and you're going to be just fine. So who's going to be able to win game 2? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Dplus KIA. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to clean up this series pretty quickly with a nice 2-0 sweep, and they are going to prove pretty definitively that a lot of the pre-series expectations for them in this one were true and were accurate. And we probably shouldn't be sleeping on DK anymore. They're now only one series officially away from qualifying for the quarterfinals. I know that that's pretty crazy to say considering they started 0-2, but they've had a couple of easy series to bounce themselves back against BDS, now against GAM, two of the weaker teams in the main stage of the tournament. In my opinion, probably the two weakest teams in the main stage of the tournament, as I've talked about before. However, this team had a really rough draw at the beginning. It's not like they lost to mediocre teams. They lost to good teams. They lost to G2. They lost to KT Rolster. These are good League of Legends teams. They've just been able to get the job done now against teams that you could expect. This final series is going to be super important for them, but for GAM, this is unfortunately the end of the line. I don't think a lot of people had a ton of expectations for them, as I've talked about, going into not only this series, but Worlds in general. general, especially after how their MSI went with them losing to Rainbow 7, with then dropping their first series of Worlds here to Loud in the play-in stage. It just didn't necessarily feel like their year. It didn't feel like the VCS's year in general, but they battled back, they got on the right page, and they played some of the best league, in my opinion, the best league that they've played all year long in, you know, the main stage of Worlds, which is super impressive. You've got to give them a lot of credit. It just wasn't going to be enough against a really good Dplus KIA team, and so let's go ahead and talk about it, starting, of course, with draft. We always start with draft on this channel. I actually really don't hate GAM's draft at all. I think there's some interesting things here. Obviously, I'm a fan of B1 Kaisa if Xayah is just not on the board. I think it's a good idea for Red Side to ban out Xayah, but it does open up the door for something like a Kaisa to potentially come in. Now, Kaisa is not unpunishable, but Xayah is just really strong, and you simply have to ban her out because there isn't a good answer that teams are clearly willing to go towards. I've seen, you know, picks like the Caitlyn or the Senna be thrown out as potential counter options, and I do agree that in isolation, that's a good idea. I understand why teams might not want to go to them in every game, but you know, clearly they're not even practicing them. So it's, you know, what am I saying? Clearly Xayah's just banner, right? If you're not going to play the champions that actually do well into Xayah, just banner. I get it. So B1 Kaisa makes a lot of sense, but what I really think ties a lot of this draft together for me is actually going to be the Nocturne. And I know that that's kind of a weird thing because I've kind of been low and down on Nocturne all year long. I've been a lot more pessimistic on what he's offered in a lot of these team comps, specifically when he's paired up with things like the Nico, because I think that Wombo combo comps are, generally speaking, just way too volatile and not consistent enough for me to, you know, recommend picking them at a regular level unless those champions are strong individually, which I just didn't think those two were, you know, during a lot of the time that they were getting picked as a duo. But Nocturne specifically on B4 into the comp that they had selected on the other side, I actually think is a really good idea. You're not exactly going to be getting on, you know, a lot of these, I guess, midliners all that efficiently, things like the Ari, things like the Rumble, without, you know, easy access, point and click access, and that's what Nocturne offers you. Specifically, the Rumble, I think, has to be really afraid of what Nocturne offers, because typically speaking, Rumble can play relatively safe in a lot of these team fights. He can get off a lot of his shit, he can position basically however he wants, and he can do a lot of damage, basically for free, because there really aren't a lot of champions in the game that can deal with him all that efficiently. Nocturne is one of the few that can do that, especially early on in games. You can really shut down the Rumble. Pairing that up with something like the Cassante, that puts top lane, in my opinion, very firmly in favor of GAM, you know, taking out the player diff, which obviously there was a big one in this game. I think Nocturne's a super interesting pick. Obviously, it's Levy's kind of signature jungler from back in the day as well, so certainly something to keep in mind there. That and the Wukong have been his two, you know, over the course of his career that he's really wanted to go towards, but it just wasn't enough. DK was a little bit better in this game. Obviously, their scaling is pretty ridiculous. They wanted to go for scaling match in the same way that GAM did, but they go for something like the Sivir that can at least exist a little bit better against Kaisa in the early game. I still like Kaisa in general in this matchup. I think Sivir is not the answer for me. I think Aphelios is essentially just a better version, although GAM did ban it out in this game, so that is worth noting, but you know, I don't know. Sivir's fine. Deft is just really good, right? That's the takeaway from this game. Deft is going to get player of the game. Once again, he's also going to get player of the series for me. Man, did Deft need to do this. He really needed to get himself back on track. He wasn't playing awful at Worlds. It wasn't him making these gigantic misplays and stepping up when he had no right to and, you know, getting dominated in lane. He just wasn't playing well. He was slightly losing, and he wasn't really having an impact on team fights, and he was almost always being the less impactful of the AD carries in the two games that he played at the beginning of this tournament, and that's just a negative. That's just not what you want to see from Deft, the former, you know, the reigning world champion, and Kellen obviously helps out with a lot of that because his reascension here is one of the better engaged supports, at least, you know, what you're kind of hoping to get out of him. He was awesome in this game and in this series, is super important towards the overall success of DK. If Deft and Kellen can get back and stay back on track, then that's going to completely change the trajectory of what DK can offer, because honestly, everybody else has been good at this tournament. Jungle Mid has been positive. Showmaker has been really good over the course of this year. I've been trying to tell everybody there were stretches, and I know it wasn't consistent, I know it wasn't week to week, but there were stretches of the year this year where Showmaker was the best player in the world. I mean, it really genuinely was like 2 or 3 week stretches where he was just dominating everyone that he would go into, even against good mid laners. He would just also have these stretches of like 2 to 3 weeks where he wasn't playing particularly well, and that consistency was worrying, but this is a player that almost always steps it up when he gets to international tournaments. I was not concerned about his performance at Worlds. Canyon has been fine, just as I predicted there as well. He was another player that people were concerned about because of the regular season performances that he was offering. It's Canyon and Showmaker. They were going to be just fine. Showmaker in particular was awesome. He basically saved the game with a really nice team fight on Ari in this one. And Kana is like sneakily super important to what this team wants to do. They put a lot of responsibility on him because they don't give him any resources, and the enemy team is constantly trying to take him down. He survives game after game after game on whatever pick that you want to offer him. Kana has very sneakily over the past 2 months been one of the better top laners in the world, and you're not going to hear a lot of people say that because the beginning of his year was super shaky. He had a lot of games in spring and even at the beginning of summer that just weren't all that fantastic, but you want to talk about the last, like, half of his split and going into playoffs and now here at Worlds, he's been awesome for this team. And if he's going to be able to keep that up, that's massive for DK as well. It really is all going to be on Deft and Kellen. And at least here and now, they showed that they can kind of perform in that way. But unfortunately for GAM, that does mean that this is the end of their tournament line. It means they're going to be heading home. But like I've said 1,000 times already, this is such an accomplishment to even be here in the first place. Not only in the main stage, but to have won a series in the main stage against a major region in Team Liquid from North America. It's just a really good Worlds from GAM. Basically everything they could have asked for and then some. I know they're going to be disappointed that they didn't really put up a fight in this series. Maybe they wanted to make these games a little bit more interesting, a little bit closer, but I mean, at that point, you're basically just grasping at straws, right? Like, this has already been such a fantastic run. A couple of their players didn't quite show up here today. Pallet is going to get another dud of the game. This was his worst series at Worlds by a pretty considerable margin. He had been a really good player for this team, though, and a lot of progress and growth was shown from him over the course of not only their play-in games, but their main stage games as well. Slater really kind of locked into this idea of not needing to be this hyper carry for this team, and I think it helped out their playstyle a lot. He got to just be a little bit more of that secondary carry that, I don't want to say facilitator, but somebody who didn't need to be the one making a lot of the plays for GAM, that didn't need to be the center of attention for what they were doing, and I think that that fit them better. You know, Slater sometimes can get a little bit over-eager, but when he kind of plays in sync with the rest of the team within tempo and not trying to buck that tempo, I think that he is incredibly talented, and he's an AD carry that actually can function at a really high level. Levy, I think, played well in this series, especially considering everything that's been going on. He really stepped up his performances as the tournament went on. He was kind of rough in the VCS, and he was kind of rough in the play-in stage as well, even in some of their wins, but by the time we got to the main stage, it really did feel like he kind of started to lock himself in and play a lot better. Kati was awesome. KIA struggled a bit in this series, but he was really good over the course of this tournament. Basically, all the positives you can take away from VCS, you absolutely should take away for GAM here. Like, this is a fantastic performance, and you just have to hope that this org and this region is going to be able to replicate this performance as we move into the future seasons, because the VCS, for a period of time, had been looking like a secret dark horse at some of these tournaments. When you look back at 2018, when you look back at 2019, you know, the pre-COVID era stuff, the VCS was looking really dominant. They just kind of got thrown off their game when they couldn't go to these international tournaments for the past couple of years, and so it's good to see them back into form. It's good to see them really dominate at this tournament in comparison to the other minor regions, and, you know, for GAM, there's absolutely nothing to be ashamed of, but for DK, they got one more series. They could potentially be making it to the quarterfinals after their rough start, which would be, you know, a really good redemption story for a lot of these players. Players like Deft and Chillmaker and Canyon that are legendary and haven't exactly performed like that over the course of 2023. It'd be nice to see this team kind of turn it around, and this is the last major step in that direction before it's do or die for them. And then moving on to our second series of day number 7, and this one is definitely more interesting on paper. We talked about the first series kind of being a blowout, not only in terms of expectations, but in terms of outcome. This second series should not be that. It's a battle between two genuinely good teams as we move into the 2-1 part of the bracket. It's a matchup between the number 3 seed from the LCK in KT Rolster and the number 3 seed from the LPL in LNG Esports. Really, really intriguing matchup between two teams that are kind of on different trajectories at the current moment. KT sort of moving down, LNG sort of moving up, at least in comparison to where they were just about a couple of months ago. And so let's go ahead and preview it very quickly. Like I said, KT Rolster definitely an intriguing spot. I think expectations for this team have absolutely plummeted, which is crazy to me. I've voiced my shock at that over the course of this tournament already. You see a lot of other popular analysts picking KT to not make it out of the Swiss stage even before things started. You know, analysts like Kadril, analysts like Dom that just aren't as high on KT Rolster and kind of don't see this roster as one that is going to perform well at this tournament. I couldn't disagree more. I think that that's just kind of an underestimation of what KT can do. I understand the org has a history of potentially underperforming in some big moments, but this team has not proven that they are that over the course of this year. And trust me, I have been a KT doubter over the course of this channel's history. I've gotten a lot of flack in my LCK videos comment sections because I've never really believed in KT the same way that the KT fans believe in them, but it's really hard to deny the fact that this team really only lost to the best teams in Korea over the course of this year. They beat Gen.G in the regular season. They 2-0'd T1 in the regular season. They just couldn't get by T1 when they had to play them twice in the playoffs, and T1 very much peaked at the right time. T1 is a genuinely good team, and KT couldn't get by them. That's not an awful thing for this KT Rolster team. I just think people are forgetting that they went 15-1 in the regular season in terms of their series score. They were the #1 seed going into the playoffs in the LCK. They easily dismantled Hanwha Life to qualify for Worlds. This was a very strong roster with a lot of really good players that are peaking at the right time. Aiming and Lehens in particular have played really well at this tournament. They've been a top 3 bot lane, quite frankly, at this tournament. I am shocked with how good Aiming and Lehens have been, not really because I don't think they're good enough to be able to perform at that level, but because the rest of the team hasn't exactly lived up to that up until this point. Keen has not really been that guy. Cousin BDD have not really created a ton of advantages, but KT's been able to win a lot of these games regardless because Aiming and Lehens have been that good. Their schedule's been really hard up until this point. Their only series that they've lost was to Billy, which is certainly not a bad series to end up losing, or a game to end up losing, and they've taken down some good teams as well. Dplus KIA is a nice win for them, and so you know, I trust KT quite a bit, but LNG on the other side might be one of the few teams at this tournament that is genuinely just kind of better than KT, as much as I'm hyping them up. Right now, I'm also a major fan of LNG. I put them at number 3 number 4 in terms of my pre-tournament power rankings, number 2 in my LPL rankings, only behind JD Gaming. This is borderline a top 2 team at this tournament. Maybe not top 2 because Gen.G does look really good right now, but are they the number 3 team at this tournament? Probably at the current moment, and that's really, really good for LNG. They have one of the scariest trios in the entire world with Tarzan, Scout, and Gala. It's almost unfair that you have to play into them, and it's not like Zika and Hong as secondary pieces are bad by any means. Hong is a top, 5 to 8 support at this tournament without question, and Zika has been really solid over the course of this year, finally being thrust into a big position on a winning team. He's lived up to that, and so LNG is a true, world finals type of team if everything were to go right, which is why I predicted them in this series to win 2-1. I think KT's good enough to be able to take a game, which is exactly what I said yesterday, but LNG's better. LNG's just one of those teams that's going to be really hard to bet against unless they're going against a team like JD Gaming because of how good they've been over the course of this year. Are they perfect? No, but are they close to it? Yes, I think Scout's been arguably the best player in the world in 2023. Gala's not a pushover. Tarzan's getting back into form. Everything's kind of clicking, and I would expect them to be favorites, but if KT ended up taking this series, and certainly if KT made it interesting, I'm not going to be surprised even a little bit, but we're going to find out if that's going to be the case, starting, of course, with game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 was LNG Esports. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0 against KT Rolster, and this is exactly what you wanted to see from LNG. You wanted to see them be able to jump out early on in these series. We talk about momentum being so important. I stress this so much when we were covering the playoffs over the past 2 months or whatever it's been. In the best of 5s, if it was that important, and I brought it up all the time in best of 5s, how important do you think it is in best of 1 or best of 3s to be able to take game number 1? It's crazy important to generate momentum, to put yourself in a good position, to kind of put your mind at ease, to give yourself a little bit of leeway moving into the second game of the series, and LNG was able to do that here with a really nice win. Now, KT definitely put up a little bit of a fight. A couple of these team fights were very close, and I think if they had a bit more gold or perhaps a slightly better team composition, this could have been a closer game for KT, but it didn't end up working out that way. LNG was just a little bit stronger. They have a much better draft, in my opinion, and they were able to take it home. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Starting, of course, with draft. That's what we do on this channel. We start with draft, and like I said earlier, I think LNG definitely got the better end of this draft. The one part that you're looking at it being like, I'm not a huge fan of that. I don't really love Jax into Cassante. I've talked about this the whole tournament. I think Jax is fine right now, but Cassante is just in such a strong state, and Jax to me is something that needs a little bit of time to rev up. I think Cassante should have a lot of the advantage early, but when you're talking about topside pressure, a lot of that does kind of get equaled out in this draft with the fact that you do get the Nico into the Jace, one of the few picks in the meta right now that I think just has way more pressure than Jace. In the early game, Nico is an early game champion, one that does want to try and snowball the game very quickly and generate leads as fast as possible. And Scout did a great job this game of actually being able to push that tempo. And when you kind of combine that topside pressure, even if Cassante is going to be kind of in favor, quote unquote, in this matchup, I don't think it's enough to be able to say that KT actually wins on the top side of this. I think LNG actually has a stronger topside because of the plays that you can make with Nico and Jarvan in the early game to try and propel the team forward and generate that tempo. Adding on to the fact that I think you have the winning bot lane here. Not only is Renata awesome in lane right now, as we've seen throughout this tournament already, we've seen, a couple of teams really highly prioritize the Renata potentially next to things like the Kalista or other, similar early game focused AD carries and, actually be able to try to dominate early, but you're going into Jinx, which I find is a very interesting pick here from KT. Certainly not the direction I would go in, definitely much more of the scaling route. There are a lot of scaling AD carries that I think are playable right now. And Jinx is definitely one of them. I'm not going to sit here and try to say that she's not playable, but you are ceding pressure in the early game over to the Aphelios, who is just going to be stronger, especially with the Renata. And so when you're looking at that, you're seeing a situation where LNG actually is in a really good spot. The problem with LNG's comp, if you want to talk about draft concerns, is the fact that I think they fall off really hard in the mid game. Not the late game. Their team fighting is actually really solid, especially if you hit the wombo, right? If you set up Nico ultimate into Renata ult, it's over, right? There's not a lot that KT can do to actually be able to answer that, but their mid game pressure isn't nearly as good. In fact, it's by far the weakest that I think they could have in this circumstance, especially in comparison to what KT offers. KT scales really well into the late game. Even picks like Jace, I think, are going to be relevant in late game team fights, and Maokai, Cassante, and Alistar as frontline and peel for Jinx is a really strong team fight comp, and so you have an idea for potentially what you want to do. So if you're LNG, you want to try to get the ball rolling as quickly as possible and try to snowball this game to the point where your bad mid game doesn't end up mattering. And for KT, you're kind of okay with potentially losing some pressure in the early game so long as you don't throw the game away. Now, that did end up playing out, unfortunately, as KT just got a little bit too far behind. LNG had a lot of the tempo early, specifically based on a lot of plays that they ended up doing bot lane, and that was a big problem for them. Gala is a very clear choice for player of the game. This was a performance from Gala. I've been hyping up Aiming and Lehens as two really good players at this tournament, and don't get me wrong, they've been a top 3 bot lane at Worlds so far through their first 3 games, but little bit different here. Moving into this series against LNG, they just weren't quite able to keep their foot on the gas in the same way, I will say. Gala and Hong are definitely a different level of opponent than what they've been playing over the course of the rest of this tournament, but Gala was phenomenal in this game. This was a world-class level performance from Gala on the Aphelios. We know how good he can be on this champion, and he put a lot of pressure on early. He got a lot of resources in the mid game, and then those late game team fights were just about as beautiful as you can draw them up. From an AD carry, you love to see an ADC that is both aggressive and clinical in terms of the execution, not putting themselves in bad positions in order to make big plays. That's really good, and Gala did that at a high level. Hong was obviously very good as well. I think Renata has proven to be a super strong pick at this tournament. I know it's not necessarily something that a lot of people would consider on the same level as some of the engagers right now, like the Alistar, like the Rakan, that have kind of popularized the meta at the current moment, but I've been saying it for months. The only reason we're not seeing more enchanters in the meta right now is because supports don't want to play them. It's not because they're not strong. Renata, Lulu, things like that can still be super effective in the right team comps, and we've seen Renata basically do nothing but dominate at this tournament up until this point, and so really good stuff from LNG in the bot lane in this game, number 1. Do want to give credit to Scout as well, putting a lot of pressure on the mid lane. I don't think it was perfect. I think he could have played a little bit more aggro, but he kind of ceded a lot of the pressure in the mid game, and that's really good to see from Scout, who has received basically all of this team's resources over the course of this year. Really good game from LNG, but man, you got to shout out that bot lane, because holy hell did they play well. And then for KT on the other side, it was tough kind of picking a dud of the game because I don't think there were some awful plays. I do think BDD was probably the least impactful player on the enemy side, even though his scoreline does look relatively good. He's going to get dud of the game in game number 1 for me. The Jace just ended up not mattering. The Jarvan could eat shock blasts all day long, and it wouldn't really matter. He was basically irrelevant by the time we hit the mid to late game, and that's awful if you're Jace. That's the concern when you draft this comp, is you are kind of looking for scaling. If you're KT Rolster with that team fight, that front to back, Maokai, Cassante, Alistar, and then Jinx on the back line, you really want Jace to be able to kind of function within that style, and he just wasn't able to do that here. And I'm not going to put it all on BDD. I don't think he individually was atrocious or anything like that. He didn't make any massive misplays, but I do think it's worth pointing out that his performance and his effect on this game was very low, especially down the stretch. I think a lot of people are going to look at Aiming's build and say that he was kind of trolling this game. Early Mortal Reminder can definitely be a little bit suspect, but I think Aiming's positioning and his actual team fighting was really good in this game. I think that he was in a lot of really good spots. He just didn't have the damage. Jinx is a champion that I think isn't nearly as strong as someone like a Felios, or in comparison to like a Kaisa, or even like a Sivir, or some of these other late game champions that we've seen throughout this tournament, isn't going to hold up nearly as well. A Zeri kind of fitting in that mold as well. We saw the Zeri and the Xayah obviously banned out, but going for something like the Jinx over Sivir is certainly a question mark in terms of damage on this particular patch. Maybe on live, that would have been a better idea, but we're not on live. You know, Jinx is still in a relatively mess spot. Lehens wasn't really helping, I would say, on the Alistar. We've seen Ali not really be all that good at this tournament, but I think the bot lane's going to be fine. Aiming individually played well. He just wasn't really dealing any damage. And I could say the same thing about BDD. He wasn't making any major errors. The champion just kind of let him down. And I think that's kind of the general overall thought for KT, is they wanted to go for a scaling comp. They wanted to give up early game, and they did that, and they weren't able to recover, and it's okay. That's going to happen every once in a while, but you probably need to adjust your strategy. LNG have shown that they're going to be able to take a lead and run with it, as you probably could have guessed, and you can't really give them that opportunity again moving into game number 2, but that's really what it's all about now. KT is on the line here in game number 2. It's still best of 3s, and so if they do end up losing this, obviously their tournament's not over, but it means they don't qualify for the quarterfinals. They have to play one more series to even have an opportunity to do so, and there's only good teams left. I know LNG is strong, but you're not going to get a much easier opponent in the next round. This is a must-win for KT. And then for LNG, you can close out the series right here and now. You do have that leeway of potentially being willing and able to drop that game number 2, but you don't want to do that. You want to close this out in a 2-0 sweep. You want to be dominant, and you want to move on to the quarterfinals, where you definitely expect to be. But are they going to be able to do that here? Well, the winner of game number 2 was KT Rolster. They are going to take game 2. They're going to keep this series alive, and they're going to be sending us to a game 3. We're tied up at 1 apiece now, and this was a fun game. It wasn't quite as, I guess, fun as maybe game number 1, or you know, it wasn't quite the closest in the entire world, but it still kind of showed us a lot, and I think KT definitely showed up in this game. This was a really fun game from them. They did basically everything right, and you got to give them a lot of credit for it. LNG made a lot of mistakes, a lot of errors in this game. There's a lot of things being said and a lot of words being thrown around that I might go off on a tangent on. And for those of you who watch my LPL weekly recaps that I've done all year long are going to be very familiar with how I end up talking about some of the narratives that kind of surround this game, but we'll get to that when we get to that. Let's talk about the draft first and foremost. Ironically enough, I still like LNG's draft better in this game. I still think you have more options for this team comp. KT really wants to win fast and early, obviously. You still have the Kaisa on B1 to try and scale, because when Xayah is taken off the board, you should be taking Kaisa on B1 if it's still left up. That's all we've seen over the course of today, is that be proven over and over again, and aiming looked awesome. We're not going to get to that just yet, but the Kaisa is really the only form of scaling you have here. You have Renekton, Sejuani, Talia as your top side. You need to be able to generate pressure fast in this game, because you are going to get outscaled. You're playing into Jax, Jarvan, Azir, Sivir. Like, you're gonna get outscaled. This is one of the hardest scaling teams I could possibly think of in the current meta for LNG. They definitely said, like, we feel comfortable enough surviving the early game, we just need to get to the late game. And the problem for KT in this game is you don't have a lot of lanes that kind of dominate on their own. You would really hope that in these situations that individually you could be sure that you would win a lot of these lanes. I think top side's relatively good here. Jax is good into Renekton, but Talia should be on the move a lot more active, a lot more often than what Azir is going to be in the early game. And Sedge, I think, in general, is going to give you a consistent amount of pressure here. And so I like that idea on the top side, but I don't know if Kaisa beats Sivir early. It's close. It's certainly kind of up for debate on how you really want to talk about that. It shouldn't really matter. Both bot lanes should be weak side in this game, but KT has options potentially to start running things, and luckily for them, they did get themselves online, and they did get the ball rolling, but I could see a world here where they don't. I think if they didn't play as well as they did, I think there's a pretty easy chance that LNG just neutralizes the early game and just wins all the team fights in the late game. I think that was definitely possible. It just didn't end up going that way, but let's go ahead and talk about the individual performances. Player of the game for me is going to go to Aiming in the bot lane. I've been hyping him up all tournament long. Can you remember last year when I was kind of an Aiming hater? Kind of wild how things have moved and adjusted. I really haven't changed my opinion on aiming all that much. I do still think that he is a little bit more of a product of the talent around him, but man, his confidence is just so through the roof right now that I think he could perform well on basically any team in the world, in any situation in the world right now. Aiming has very much developed himself into being one of the most consistent AD carries in the world, and to come from where he was just a couple of years ago, a player that was constantly just kind of falling out of teams, not necessarily being a big proactive member of the rosters he was on before he rejoined this KT team, to where he's at now, it's major development and it's crazy positive. Obviously, getting to play with some really good supports has helped him with that. Life was awesome last year for this team, even if he didn't work well with HLE this year, and Lehens is arguably the best support in the world. But that being said, aiming still has to fulfill his end of the bargain, and ever since he's been getting more resources from this team towards the back half of summer and beyond, he's done a billion times better with it than almost any other AD carry. So you just have to give him a lot of credit. This was a great game from him, and his mechanics have really started to shine through. Lehens continues to be a major positive for this team, but it's not just him. BDD had a much better game number 2 than he did a game number 1. Cuz has consistently been able to out-jungle Tarzan through the first 2 games, and we'll get to that narrative in a second. Keen, was fine. He didn't really have to do a whole ton. It's kind of a bad matchup for Renekton after the nerfs, but in general, KT did so much in the early game to establish that pressure, to establish that tempo, that basically anything they did from that point onwards was just going to be damage control, if you will. And then for LNG, quick tangent. Again, if you watch my LPL videos, you're going to be super familiar with this, and so I'll try to keep it relatively brief. But if you're new to the channel for Worlds, or if you just watch some of the other regions, welcome to this rant. LPL fans, especially like Reddit, and Twitter does this too, but especially Reddit, have this really, in my opinion, annoying trait that I like to point out, where they will pick a couple of players every single year or every single split and just blame them for everything. They will just say, they're the problem, they're the worst players of all time, they're chokers, this is the narrative that we have to craft around these players, whether it's true or not. And in this case, in my opinion, it's just not true. And the narrative this year has been around Tarzan. People have been flaming the absolute living hell out of Tarzan. Not just English LPL fans, but Chinese LPL fans. There was that famous video of him walking out after a post-game when they lost, when they got upset by Invictus Gaming, and fans berating him as he exits the arena. And this is just kind of the narrative that the LPL has. I don't think other regions have this nearly as much, but the word that I use to describe it is overreactions. That is kind of what the LPL fandom is built off of, in my opinion, is overreactions, is these big blanket black and white statements that it doesn't really matter if they're true, they're narratives, and so they're going to run with them. And I want to try and dispute them. I started this channel partly because I was so frustrated at the lack of patience that the League of Legends community shows a lot of the top tier players when they start to perform anything but perfect. And players like Tarzan have bad games. They're going to have bad games. He's a facilitative type of jungler. He does take a few risks, and some of those engages aren't going to work out. He's going to play poorly sometimes, but saying that over the course of his entire career, he's been nothing but a choker for any team that he's played for. And, I've seen a lot of comments that he's the reason that Griffin couldn't win games, and that, he's the reason Griffin ended up failing. Like, it's just such a baseline take to me. It's such like a smooth brain take in my head that it's really hard for me to wrap my head around it. I'm not going to pretend like Tarzan played well this game. He's the dud of the game for a reason. This was a poor Jarvan performance. Like, everything that I'm saying is within the confines of me admitting that Tarzan didn't play well in this one game, but he didn't play well in one game. Are you telling me he can't have one game? Like, Tarzan plays well in 9 of 10 games, and that one game is the one that everybody remembers and everyone talks about. And that's the reason why, generally, and, not to pat myself on the back too much, I really try not to do that on this channel, but it's the reason why, even in comparison to some of the other regions, the LPL has by far been my most accurate. Why I'm most accurate on player development, why I'm the most accurate on team success, is because I think the narratives surrounding the LPL are so close to being correct, they're just not. And what I want to tell LPL fans that are worried about Tarzan and that are worried about LNG and some of these performances, and Tarzan being a choker, or even in the same thing for Chovy being choky, or, choking away, things like that, or Peanut in the same vein, calm down. We're gonna be fine. They're gonna be fine. For the most part, if you individually analyze these players' performances over the past few years, they've been fine in big moments. Tarzan's gonna be fine. He's been really good at this tournament up until this point. He had one bad game, and he wasn't great in game 1, but he was good enough in game 1, and he played poorly in game 2, but everybody kind of played poorly. Gala and Hong got completely outplayed in the late game. Scout certainly had no pressure on the map on the Azir. It wasn't just Tarzan underperforming, and so I just calmly ask that we try to take a more nuanced approach to this discussion. That being said, LNG did not look good in this game. Like I said, everybody kind of underperformed, and Tarzan simply does have to be better, but I'm not saying he can't be better. I actually expect him to be better. This is exactly what happened in the regular season. People started flaming Tarzan, like I talked about, berating him after games, and what did he do? He went around, and he was one of the best junglers in the entire world for the second half of the summer split. He was amazing in their finals run in the summer split. I expect him to kind of have a similar turnaround. It's something Tarzan has done super consistently. He is a player that I trust a lot, and even if the narrative is kind of swinging against him at the current moment, I believe in him, and it's going to be interesting to see how the rest of his tournament develops. And then, for the rest of the team, they have to step up as well. Gala and Hong were not nearly as good as they were in Game 1. They gave up a ton of pressure. Sivir really shouldn't be able to do that, especially if you're going to R5 that. You really need to be able to establish something on the bot side of the map. But Leona is such a nothing pick in the current meta. She's by far the worst engager that's actually getting relevant picks here at Worlds. And Sivir's not a kind of champion that can actually follow up on a lot of the engages that Leona has. Scout, like I said, was pretty inactive. Zika looked okay on the Jax, but again, only so much you can do. LNG just looked out of sorts, but you're allowed a game off. They struggled in game 2. They have all the opportunities in the world to bounce back here in game number 3, but KT just needs to keep their foot on the gas. They need to remember the team that they are, and they need to look at this win and say, okay, if we can generate that pressure early, if we can make sure the tempo is on our side, we're going to be in a good spot. So are they going to be able to do that for game 3, or is LNG going to fight back and equalize and take this series? Well, the winner of game number 3 was LNG. They are going to be able to take game number 3. They're going to take this series 2-1, and they will officially be our third team to qualify for the quarterfinal stage here at Worlds to get out of the Swiss stage with their third win here. Congratulations to them. Obviously, they deserve it. They're one of the best teams in the world. They've only lost to JD Gaming at this tournament, who I think a lot of people consider to be the best team in the world. And even then, they took a game off of them, which is still pretty darn good, but outside of that, they've looked basically untouchable. Game 2 was a little bit not great, if we're being entirely honest, but it really was a lot of them just kind of underperforming, and that's going to happen. I still think their draft ideology is smart and strong, and typically speaking, their drafts over the course of this year have been really good, and KT, they're a good team. Losing to them isn't exactly the worst thing in the entire world, but looking at this game number 3, this was the LNG that I think we wanted to see in this series. We wanted to see them come out and just outperform and overperform their expectations, and this is what they did here in game 3. Really, really good stuff from basically everybody. I think that there's a lot of positive stuff to go around. Player of the game in game number 3, some people might not like it, it's going to go to Tarzan. He was the best player in this game, at least in my opinion. I do think it's debatable. I don't think it's 100% Tarzan. It could be Gala as well, and we'll get to Gala in just a second, but this is why you don't freak out about Tarzan. And even then, I thought he played really well in this game. He team fought super, super good. And, on Wukong, you're allowed to give over pressure in the early game if your mid-game engages are going to be fantastic, because that's really where Wukong kind of separates himself in the current meta, is as a mid-game skirmisher. Not that he can't have a really good early game if he gets tempo, but he doesn't necessarily have the pressure of needing to be active in the early game. And I see a lot of people kind of discrediting Tarzan, like, oh, he did nothing for 10 minutes and then started doing really well. Yeah, it's Wukong. I don't know what to tell you, man. He's in a really good spot. I get that KT Rolster scales really well, and you do want to kind of put your foot on the gas, but you don't scale badly. You've got Wukong engages alongside Rakan with Orianna Kai'Sa as a potential carry duo. It's not like you're inept in the back half of the game, and so I don't hate the idea of potentially waiting for a mid-game power spike, which in my opinion is where LNG really does have their biggest advantage. I think this team actually played the game really well, and I think Tarzan actually navigated the game really well. This is why I wasn't concerned, because he does have bounce-back performances like this. Now, I understand that I'm probably still going to get some comments about being a little bit of a homer for Tarzan and maybe just oh, you're just defending him for no reason. I get that. There's really nothing I'm going to be able to say here if you haven't already, commented that's going to change your mind, right? You either think that or you don't. But I just want to say, take a look at this game from a bigger perspective. If Cuz had played this game for KT Rolster on the other side, I think a lot of people would say that, oh, this was a really good game from Cuz. He continued to play really well in this series. And I think it's fair to say that Tarzan had a really good game number 3, even if the beginning parts of this series weren't ideal for him. He usually comes up when it matters the most, and this was a good example of that. But player of the series as a whole, obviously, is going to go to Gala. This was a phenomenal series from Gala. He ends up performing like a top 80 carry basically every time he's asked to. I might even be low on Gala at this point. I put him at number 15 in my top 20 players at this tournament, and that might be too low with how good he has been. He has gotten better game after game after game playing with LNG over the course of this year. He honestly was struggling a bit at the start of the split when he joined LNG and when he was kind of new to the team, but as he's gotten more accustomed, as he's gotten more comfortable playing with the rest of these players, he's turned into, honestly, a better version of RNG Gala, and that was a pretty high bar to end up crossing. This is some of the best that he's ever played, and I'm really impressed to be able to say that he was player of the series as a whole. Scout looked good here. I think his performance is going to get a little bit overrated. He actually waited to pick the Orianna on B5 and got a really good matchup because of it. Azir is just not a very blind pickable mid. There really aren't a lot of good blind pick mids in the meta right now, but Orianna is very good into Azir. It's one of Orianna's best matchups specifically in the current meta, so you're happy to be able to get that. Renekton has a ton of prio on the top side. Kai'Sa is going to have pressure on the bot side because of the Rakan in this matchup. And so you're sitting pretty good. This is kind of a draft gap coming in from LNG, and I do think they executed on it well. Basically, everybody played well on the side of LNG in this game number 3. I think Gala obviously is the standout performer, but Hong continues to be a positive. I think Tarzan looked great in game 3, and Zika, I think, in general, played really well this series. There's just a lot of good to take away from LNG, specifically because they were able to beat a KT Rolster without Scout really being this, like, integral force in any of the games, which is super fun. And then for KT on the other side, they tried their best. They had some interesting moments, but this game 3 was easily their worst of the series, and maybe their worst of the tournament up until this point. It just wasn't very good coming in from them, and that's okay. I think that a lot of their players did end up underperforming in this game. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Keen on the top side. He's very quietly been, like, really bad at this tournament. I'm not sure if that's something that I'm going to expect him to continue to keep up, but he's really not played good games at this tournament, whether it's in the best of ones or in the best of threes, and that's definitely something to keep an eye on. He's a player that has performed well on the international stage in the past, and so, you know, we'll see if that ends up being an issue for KT Rolster. They've really had to rely on aiming to be a pivotal carry for them throughout this tournament, especially in the earlier days, and it's going to be kind of a problem if that continues. That could be something that does keep KT Rolster back. I trust Keen a lot, though. He dominated the LCK this year. Even though the LCK top laners are kind of weak in comparison to maybe some other roles, I still think Keen is a good player, and, you know, I think he should be able to bounce back. It's just worth noting that this was not a good Ornn game. It was bad positioning. It was taking bad fights, especially in the early game, not really understanding maybe how to properly utilize this Ornn as weak side. It was just very weird stuff coming in from Keen. Very uncharacteristic gameplay from him, but Cuz was good across this whole series. I think a lot of people would argue he was the better jungler. I think you can definitely make that argument in games 1 and 2. Not so much in game 3. Obviously, Tarzan was really good in game 3, but Cuz still did some interesting things. I just think the Vi pick handicaps him so much. There's really not a lot he can do. You need to be able to snowball the game on Vi, and you don't really have a comp that's going to allow you to be able to do that. I think Vi actually put them really far behind in terms of this draft. The Azir and the Aphelios just took way too long to get online. Aiming didn't play nearly as well in Game 3 as he did at any point in Games 1 or 2. Lehans was just kind of a non-factor. Alistar seems to be cursed at this Worlds, and BDD was the worst mid laner of the two in this series. And so, you know, KT gonna take their loss, gonna take their lump here, but they're still at 2-2. They're not eliminated from Worlds by any means. They now join all these other teams in the 2-2 part of the bracket. They have one more series now. They could get lucky. They could not get lucky. There are a lot of teams you don't want to draw in this 2-2 part of the bracket, but there are quite a few teams that you're going to be pretty okay to see if you do end up drawing, especially some of the ones that we'll talk about later on at the end of this video, but they were fine in this series. Being able to take a game off of LNG is not the easiest thing to do in the entire world. And to be able to have a couple players that really did show up and perform in this series, Cuz in particular, but aiming in my opinion as well, I think is definitely something to be excited about, pun intended. KT just has some interesting things that you can kind of latch onto. They're just maybe not one of the, you know, borderline A+, S- tier teams in the world like LNG is at the current moment. And that's okay, right? KT's probably not a finals team, but they should be a quarterfinals team. And then for LNG, they could be a finals team. Like, they really could potentially be a top 2 team in the world, especially if the bracket ends up going their way. If they get on a side of the bracket that doesn't have JDG or Gen.G, they're probably the 3rd best team at this tournament right now, and them qualifying for Worlds, I think, is definitely a positive. Tarzan's going to be more consistent than people want him to be. You know, I know people like to shit on him, but he's good as a player, and Gala has been out of his mind. Scout has been the best player in the world in terms of performances. This truly is, like, a super team, and if they can continue performing like it, if their drafts continue to be so good, I can't really see this team doing any worse than potentially semifinals. All right, but that is going to do it for my day number 7 coverage here of the Swiss stage at Worlds 2023. We are right at the final day of round number 4, if you will. By the end of tomorrow, we are going to know, or by the end of tonight, I guess, as this video is coming out, we are going to know our teams that are, or 6 teams that are going to be battling it out for the final 3 spots in the quarterfinals. It's going to be interesting, but 2 teams will qualify for the quarterfinals tonight. We've got 2 matchups to go ahead and preview. We'll start with LNG taking on G2 Esports. Really fun matchup between these 2 teams. I'm glad to see LNG get to 2-1 this early on in the tournament. Their schedule has definitely been favorable for them, but they're not a pushover by any means. There are worse teams at this tournament than LNG, and that has become abundantly clear. That being said, G2 is definitely better than LNG. They should be able to take the series, and they should be able to qualify for the quarterfinals. I think you can look basically across the board at what G2's been doing, and you can feel confident that they are, quite frankly, just better in every role. They're more clinical, they're more talented, and they're more practical in terms of how they're able to execute on a lot of the strategies that they end up coming up with. I've underestimated G2 at multiple points throughout this tournament. It's not going to happen in this series. As much as I do like LNG, and as much as I really don't think that they are pushovers like they're being made out to be, G2 is the team that I think is kind of to beat coming out of the West, and that has been clear the entire tournament. And then for T1 and Billy Gaming, this is a very fun matchup, and honestly, I'm going to be real with you guys. I don't want to predict this. I will, because it's what I do on this channel, but when I tell you I don't want to say a team because I'm 99% sure that whoever I say is just going to lose, I mean it. This is probably the hardest, like, 50-50 that I've had over the course of this tournament. It's been tough to pick, you know, games like C9 Fnatic, or, you know, there were games before as well that were just very difficult to end up trying to decide who I think was going to be able to take them, even like a G2 Weibo or a G2 DK early on in the tournament. But T1 BLG trumps all of that. I could see a world in which T1 really shows up, in which the momentum that Owner was able to build in his previous series against Cloud9 ends up translating, and T1 is able to generate a ton of momentum very quickly against Billy. But I could also see a world in which BLG is just, like, more talented, because I think when you look down the line, outside of mid lane, I think BLG has an advantage in every single role. Potentially support, if KIA can get back to some of his form, but I would take Elk over Guma, although I think it's very close. I think Elk has been performing better. I would take June over Owner for sure in the current meta, and I think Bin's the best top laner in the world. And so I'm going to pick BLG, but it's, like, so narrow. I think this will be 2-1, one way or the other. I don't think either of these teams ends up blowing out the other. If T1 wins this, do not tell me that I got this shit wrong. I'm going to count it as a wrong, because that's what we do on this channel, but I'm batting like 80%, and if T1 wins this, I don't know. I believe in them more than I think a lot of other analysts will. I'm just not quite comfortable enough to say that they're going to be able to beat Billy, who I do trust a lot. And so let me know what you guys think down in the comment section below. Do you agree with me that that's a very difficult game to pick, or do you think BLG is going to blow them out like every other analyst seems to think at the current moment? Would love to know your thoughts and opinions down below. Of course, if you did enjoy the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people. If you are new here, hit the subscribe button. We're covering every single day of Worlds, as you know, with quarterfinals coming up very soon. We've got quarters, and then semis, and then finals. But even after that, we're going to be doing a lot of off-season coverage on this channel, a lot of the roster swaps, a lot of the rumors. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff as well, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do end up going live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all